I thought it was time for me to do a fairly thorough introductory tutorial on digital painting. And we're talking about Photoshop. So if you haven't worked with Photoshop for a while, this will be a bit of a refresher. If you've never painted seriously in Photoshop before, I've got some fun things to show you. So I'm going to start by opening up Photoshop, and I reset my preferences so that it's kind of a fresh look at Photoshop. And of course, we're presented with the home screen. And if you want to go directly to the Photoshop app, just click the little Photoshop icon in the upper left. A couple of things I'm going to do to fix my screen. This is your standard workspace. It's got a lot of stuff in it that we don't really need right now. So I'm going to start by going to Window, Workspace, and picking one of the other preset workspaces, and we're going to go right to Painting. So let's choose Painting. And what you've got here in your panel selection on the right are your swatches. You've got your brushes panel. You've got a navigator, which I'll show you a little bit about that too. You've got layers, channels, paths. And I will explain all of that. You also have a little mini stack of panels, and that includes brush settings, which is very handy, tool presets, which we will talk about, and your libraries, which you probably won't be accessing quite at this point. So let's go ahead and start by opening up a new document. The new project, the Phobia project, asks for a document that is at least 200 pixels per inch and a minimum of 8 inches on a side and a maximum of 11 by 17 inches. So let's go ahead and create our document first. Getting the document specs right from the beginning is really important. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, New, and let's go to Art and Illustration. And let's go with inches. The resolution we're going to set for our purposes at 200. And the width, let's make it 8 inches. And make the height 8 inches also. The background for now will be white, and just leave the other settings right now. So we're going to go ahead and create, and this is going to be our little experimental document that we're going to play with right now. If you were working on a serious illustration that might go to print, I would definitely work with a minimum of 300 pixels per inch. The higher the resolution, the crisper and more detailed your image will be for the set dimensions. Let's jump right in. Our colors are, instead of having a fill icon and a stroke icon as you do in Illustrator, and here let's make this a little bigger so we can see more of it. You have a foreground color and a background color, and I'll show you how that all works. To zoom in and out of your view of this canvas, just hold down Command and hit the minus sign to zoom out, or hit the plus sign to zoom in. And if you want this canvas to fit the workspace window at its max, just hit Command 0. Command 1 shows the canvas at its printed physical size on your screen, as close as it can be. All right, so we have a foreground color set to black. Our background color is white. We have a white background on our canvas. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to pull out my brushes panel so you can see it better. We've got general brushes, dry media brushes, wet media brushes, special effects brushes, and I loaded the darken brushes set that I uploaded to Basecamp for you. So this is a big set. We will take a look at that, but let's go with the general brushes right now. We're going to open that up. We're also going to open up our brush settings. All right, so we've got these two panels. These are the ones that you will most likely use most of the time when you're painting digitally. So let's go ahead and just pick a soft round brush. And notice as we scroll over the brush shapes in the brush settings panel, it shows you really what's going on with that brush, each one. There's a lot of settings for these brushes, and it's really easy to get overwhelmed. So what I would do is take this very slowly. Eventually, I would say once you've been working this for 6, 7, 8 hours, you'll really have a good handle on this. Let's go up to the soft round brush and click it. And this brush settings panel shows you exactly what's going on. It gives you a little preview of the brush. All right. Let's separate this a little bit. I'm going to move this over here. So I now have my brush tool selected. And this is, if I just use, I'm using my mouse, which is probably the worst thing in the world to use to paint with. And let's zoom in a little bit on this. So it has a soft edge. And if you notice, the size of the brush tip is set to 13 pixels. The hardness is set to 0, so it's a very soft edged brush. You can see it looks a little fuzzy. And the spacing is set to 25. So as you work with the brushes, let me show you what happens when you change the settings. So I'm going to select all and then hit delete so I have a fresh canvas. And I'm going to set that to the background color, and there we go. I'm going to click and hold down the shift key, then let go. Click, hold down the shift key. That's a great way to constrain your brush. Notice the more I go back and forth, that brush acts a little bit like a real brush and gets a little darker. I'm going to go ahead over here and change the size of the brush from 13 to about 40. And notice my brush tip changed. And you can also see the softness a little better the bigger the brush tip gets. And of course, if I don't hold down the shift key, I have a free form brush. If I want to change the hardness of the brush, I use this slider. And let's take the hardness to 50. And you can see that looks a little bit tighter. And if we took the hardness all the way to 100, now it looks very, very sharp on the edges. So already, just with the size, the hardness settings, you can change the look of the brush quite a bit. Let's look at the spacing. And this is all about the brush tip shape. What's happening here too is, notice as we make these changes here, the preview of the brush changes too. That gives you kind of a look at what the brush is going to be. Okay, so I'm going to clean my canvas up again. Give us a fresh canvas. Let's try the spacing setting. All right, so this is, let's bring the brush size down to 40, the hardness to 50%, and this is the spacing set to 1%. And I'm just going to hold down my shift key. As I increase, what that means is how much spacing is there between each incident of the brush tip. So really it looks like a continuous stroke. It's really the brush tip getting replicated as you drag it across. Now if I start to play with the spacing, look at that. You can actually see the individual brush tip. Click. That's an interesting look, isn't it? And let's really play with the spacing, spread it out. And say I want a very sharp dotted line, something that looks like a dotted line. We would increase the hardness all the way to 100. Maybe increase the spacing and lower the size. This is all from one single soft round brush tip. You can see the number of variations are limitless. All right, let's try another brush. Let's do the soft round pressure size brush. And you notice the difference. This soft round has a pretty uniform look to it. The soft round pressure size brush has a little bit of an angle to it. That's why it looks the way it does. It's almost as if you were holding your brush at an angle and then drawing and then pulling it down. Let's do something else too. Let's change the color. So if I double click on the color, the foreground color, I get the color picker. And most students will just kind of click around and kind of haphazardly look for color that they like. Well, let's look at a couple of the settings here. The tall column here is really your hue control. In other words, what is the actual color? What you really want to be looking at is this HSB or RGB controls. Okay, HSB stands for hue, saturation, and brightness, and those are very important settings. If you'll notice, when I drag the hue slider, the saturation and the brightness do not change. All we're doing is changing the actual color. So say we settle on a purple color, and then we click to saturation. Saturation means the intensity of the color. It's more like a tint. All right, this is more of a how much of the actual hue is going to be part of this, and then you can move that around. And then for brightness, it really refers to how much white and black or the values of the color are. So when the brightness goes to 0, of course you have 0. And the other settings stay the same as I drag this up all the way up to, what do you think? This is the brightness set to 100. You can see the difference there. And of course you can always just drag along, click in and drag right through. Alright, so we're going to pick, we're going to go with this kind of ochre, yellow ochre color. I'm going to click OK. And I have the soft round pressure size. Let's see what happens here. All right, that actually looks very similar to the look of the soft round brush. But let's go ahead and play with some of the settings here. See, it has a nice soft edge. Spacing, this gets interesting also. We've changed the color. We've worked with the size, the hardness, and the spacing. I'm going to clean my canvas again. And we're really looking right now at the shape dynamics. Let's look at the shape dynamics. So here is, I'm going to hold down my click and hold down my shift key. Let's go back to the brush tip shape and pull it back so that it's connected. We'll take a look at shape dynamics. There are these settings: size jitter, minimum diameter, angle jitter, roundness jitter, and a couple of other settings down here. What jitter means is that is there going to be any kind of variation in the size of the brush tip while you're painting. And right now it's set to 0, so there is no jitter, no variation in the size. But if we start to pull that up a little bit, let's make it 25 and see if there's much of a noticeable difference. Not a whole lot. There's a little bit, but because the brush tips are so close together, I don't think you can really see it. So let's increase the spacing. Go back to shape dynamics and increase the size jitter. And you can see that the application of the paint with the brush tip is varying a lot. The size is jittering. Let's take that up even more. You'll have more of a contrast between the... That's pretty interesting. This is, again, we've only looked at 2 brush tips so far. Hit all, hit delete, and background color, fine. So let's set the size jitter to about 60. The minimum diameter, well, let's take a look at this. There it is. Now if we change the minimum diameter, the smallest incident of the brush tip is a lot closer to the actual size. So you can see that there's more variation in the sizes with that minimum diameter set to 0. There's also pen pressure you can set if you're using a graphics tablet, so that the harder you press on your stylus, the darker and the more obvious the change in the brush settings will be. So we're going to leave that off for now because we don't really have, I'm drawing with a mouse, painting with a mouse. Let's look at angle jitter. This may or may not show much. Not a whole lot. Let's get a little darker color here so you can see. All right. And then the roundness jitter messes with the actual shape of the brush tip. So that you'll see that here, in this one here, the brush tips are all of the generally same shape. But if we add an angle jitter, look at that. Now that's kind of a very nice decorative, it's turning into a nice decorative border. If we go back to the hardness and bring the hardness up all the way, look at that. That's kind of fun. All right, I'm going to grab a color from my swatches panel. And I'm going to go ahead and change the size of this brush. All right. This is all we've just looked at 2 brush tips so far. Let's go ahead and turn off shape dynamics and look at scattering. So this is your brush right now, and this is spacing. If we take the spacing down, it's got a little bit of a, you can see the circular brush tips. You can see that little overlap, but if we turn the spacing down to 1, it looks very smooth. Okay. And we can make the hardness, make it a little softer. So it has a little bit of a softness. If you want to replicate real paint, you're probably going to want to make sure that there's a lowered hardness. Now I'm going to hit Command 0 and then hit Command minus to take it down a little bit. All right, so let's look at the scattering. And it's really useful to have this preview here. Try both axes. It almost looks alive, doesn't it? I'm gonna go to brush tip shape and maybe take the softness, increase the softness. Okay, so while we're doing this, I want you to also now look at the control panel up here. The painting mode is normal. Here's your brush. All right, this 34 soft. It shows you what the brush is. This is very similar to what's here in the brush tip shapes. You can paint with different modes, and I'm going to show you how that works in a second. You can also control the opacity of the brush. So let's take that down. Oh, look at that. And you can run it right over the original. So let's look at modes. If you've taken Photoshop, you know that there are layer modes. And these work very similar. This is really about how one color interacts with another color. Let's try multiple. Look at that. It's very nice. It shows more when you paint over the transparent sections. You could try, I'm not sure if these are going to work or not. No, that didn't work. Okay. Let's increase the opacity. So be aware of the modes here. This is just you can set if you're using a graphics tablet. The graphics tablet will always, the stylus will always pick up the opacity. This is the flow of the color. Let's make this normal again. Let's try a different color. Go back to a red. Well, here's some color in your swatches panel. Let's go with a bright Kelly green. All right, here we go. Use the preview window to get an idea of what your brush is going to look like. Looks like a slab. There I go. It looks like a Gumby brush. All right, let's go down to texture. There are some preset textures in here. Let's see if we can get these to work. I'm not quite sure. I'm getting a little texture in here. Zoom in a little bit on this. Got that texture in the brush. Let's take the opacity up to 100. That's nice. We can change the scale of the texture in there. Let's change the color. Let's try some of the other textures. These are pretty cool. Bet you didn't know you could do this. Well, maybe you did. Okay. Now the scale here refers to how big that texture is going to be inside the brush stroke. So let's try overlay maybe. Let's try multiply. I'll bet you didn't know you could do this. If you really get into painting with Photoshop, you are going to have so much fun, you may never do anything else. Alright, here's dual brush. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to hit clear. Now notice that when you paint, the pattern creates a fillable shape. But what you really have here with the dual brush is you have the pattern brush now being used with this other brush. It kind of combines them. So here I'm switching to another brush. And if you look carefully, you will see that the little speckles of this brush contain the other brush pattern. Color dynamics. This is a whole lot of fun. Let's turn off the dual brush. Let's turn off the texture so that our brush goes back, and let's go. This is our shape dynamics. We'll turn those off and we'll go to our brush shape. Let's try this. It's kind of a, I don't know, looks like a starburst or a cauliflower. Now because it's the density, the spacing is so tight, you can't really see it, but if we spread out the spacing a little bit, that's nice. And the size. Okay, now we're back to our basic brush tip controls. The let's try something else here. That looks interesting. And you'll see a preview of the brush on your screen. But color dynamics is really, really cool. So let's set the brush tip, space it out a little bit. Something, it looks like an artifact from Alien. All right, we have a single color. Now let's go to color dynamics and let's play with the, it doesn't really change anything, but the hue jitter, this should have a big effect, and it doesn't. Saturation jitter. There we go. There's the brightness jitter. Really, you've got to go in there and play with these things. Take a few notes. If you find a brush setting, size, type of brush tip that you like, go right ahead and make a note of that. Clear. Switch to a blue. Apply this to tip. There you go. Now once I hit apply to tip, the color changes from tip to tip. That's what I was looking for. You don't need no gummy bears. You need this. All right, let's try this, see what this does. Go back to brush tip shape, and let's try another brush. That looks cool. Oh yeah. So let's go to edit, clear. You can tell right away this brush tip is too big, so we're going to bring this way down. And while you've got the brush tip preview here, you can just hit the left and right bracket keys to increase or decrease the size of the brush. Oh yeah, you had no idea you could do this with Photoshop, right? So let's go to shape dynamics. Let's turn on the shape dynamics and let's do the size jitter. You can see the change in the size of the brush expressions. The angle jitter. The roundness jitter. Now that color dynamics right now, it's a little much. So let's take the hue jitter down. And what that means is I'm assuming that my color range will be much less. Can you see that? Now the range of colors are closer together. Let's take the hue even down further. It's getting even closer. Boy, that's a beautiful little brush. Purity. I have no idea what that is. Yes, there are things here I don't know. We'll change the saturation jitter so you have deeper and lighter or more opaque versions of the color. And that's where I'm going to stop right now. We're going to come back to the brush settings in the next video, but I don't want these to get too long. This is a good introduction. So get started. I want you to just play with the brush tips and have a lot of fun.